Hey everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In this video, I want to go over some things that I think are a little bit weird about Swedish politics. I'm an American that's been living in Sweden for almost 4 years now, and the political systems in the US and Sweden are very, very different. And I don't think there's necessarily a right way or a wrong way, but in some instances, some of the policies I think can be a little bit strange to me coming from a different place just because it's not what I am used to, it's not what I grew up with, and that's what I want to explain. Some of these things that are the most weird and surprising to me as a foreigner living in this country. I hope this video is super interesting for you guys, so without further ado, let's jump into it. Now the first thing I want to mention are the colors associated with the political parties in the US and in Sweden. In the US, red is associated with the Republicans, which is the more conservative party, and blue is associated with the Democrats, which is the more liberal party of the two major parties in the US. In Sweden, we have quite the opposite. The most liberal left-wing parties are associated with the color red. So we have Vänsterpartiet, which actually has its roots as sort of a communist party. They're not that extreme anymore, but definitely they're rooted in some of those ideologies. They really appreciate socialism and all of these sorts of things. Then you have the Social Democrats, which is the largest party here in Sweden, is also red. They're not quite as far left as Vänsterpartiet. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have the blue color. So the most conservative parties in Sweden are represented by the color blue. So completely opposite to the colors that we have in the US when we're looking at this spectrum of like being liberal versus conservative. It can be a little bit confusing when using colors and terminology to actually describe the politics. And of course, they have a lot of major political parties in Sweden with the parliamentary system. In the US, there's just really the two. Even for me, being an American citizen, the political party that I probably have the closest ideology to would be like the Libertarian Party, which is actually yellow, fun fact, but they have such a small percentage of people that support that party. So a vote for the Libertarian Party in America wouldn't really go anywhere. So I would find myself normally voting for the more liberal Democratic Party in the US, but I always try to see both sides. And it's interesting because now me in Sweden, I find myself more going towards those blue parties, those a bit more conservative parties. Actually, I took the political quiz a couple of years ago when it was the election season here in Sweden, and the party that I got was the Center Party, which is most closely aligned with the Libertarian Party that we have in the US. Because taxes, for example, in Sweden are already so high, or some of the political ideologies are much more left of center than what I'm used to growing up in America, I tend to just fall a little bit more on that right side here. So it's interesting. In America, I'm more of a Democrat, and in Sweden, when you compare to the Swedish political parties, I'm more on the other side of the spectrum, more conservative here in Sweden, if you were to compare me. And I think that's what's really, really interesting. Growing up, where you're from definitely plays a big part in your political beliefs. Now, one thing I find that's very, very interesting and a little bit weird is the difference, because in the US, the very rural areas that are away from the big cities typically vote conservative. They're typically Republicans, and the big cities are typically more liberal Democratic areas. And in Sweden, it seems to be the opposite, because if we look at this political map of election results, you see the blue areas, the more conservative parties, are in the big cities, and the rural areas, pretty much everywhere else, is the red, more socialistic parties. So this, I'm not exactly sure why the rural areas in Sweden tend to be more socialistic, whereas the rural areas in the US tend to be more conservative. Completely different. You would think that similar areas and similar demographics would have similar voting preferences among the two countries, at least on the spectrum, but that doesn't seem to be the case when comparing the two. Now, as I was saying, in general, Sweden is a lot more left-leaning, a lot more progressive compared to the US politics that I was born and raised with. So if you were a Swede and you moved to America, 90% chance you'd probably be a Democrat in general. Not everybody, of course, I cannot make a representation for everybody, but in general, the average Swede is very, very left-leaning, and that's reflected in their political parties. With that being said, it's very, very weird and interesting because there's some issues that get politicized in the US, and Sweden is actually representing more of the conservative side of those issues. For example, two that I'm going to mention here in this video is the first one is the ideology around the coronavirus pandemic. Now, in the US, it's become more of the conservatives that are representing we need personal freedom, you don't need to wear a mask, you should go out and live your life. The conservatives have had that ideology in the US, and the liberals have been more about wearing masks, quarantining, staying inside, social distancing in terms of the spectrum. And you can see this, the states that are more conservative leaning in the US are earlier to open up their states, earlier to want to get back to normal. And we can also see the difference in how it was handled with the presidents going from a conservative president in Trump to a more liberal president in Biden. Now in Sweden, it's very, very interesting because Sweden's a very liberal society, but they also had some of the most relaxed restrictions around the coronavirus. Now, the Swedish people really appreciate their personal freedoms, and they didn't want the government to step in and tell them what to do. The government has provided recommendations that people follow. There are restrictions and there are things, of course, that people cannot do. For example, you can't have more than 4 people in a group when you're going out into town. The restaurants and bars close at 8:30. So there are, of course, restrictions. But when you compare to other countries, they've been a lot more relaxed. We never had official lockdown mandates. We didn't have to be forced to stay at home like a lot of countries had. And the Swedish people said the government doesn't have the right to take away our personal freedoms according to Swedish law, which is definitely more of that conservative ideology in the US, even though Sweden's a more liberal society, which I find to be very, very fascinating. Another sort of paradox that we see in Swedish politics is their stance on alcohol and drugs. In Sweden, even though it's more of a liberal society, they have a much, much more conservative view towards drugs and alcohol. For example, they have the state-run liquor stores, which I've talked about many times on my channel, that are only open at certain times, that really control the purchase and sales of alcohol, and then certain drugs. Sweden is very, very hard and has criminalized all drugs like marijuana or anything stronger, whereas a lot of states now in the US, marijuana is actually legal. And you see it's the liberal side of the politicians that are really pushing for the legalization of drugs in the US. All the states where it's become recreationally legal, like my home state of Washington, and then you even got Oregon and California, so basically the whole West Coast now, marijuana is legal in the US. Those are all primarily democratic states. So how is it that Sweden, being such a liberal society that really appreciates personal freedom, especially you could see in the way that they handled the coronavirus pandemic, it's very, very odd to me that they would handle the pandemic in that way, but then be very, very strict in putting restrictions on people into what they can actually put into their body. And then on the flip side, if you look at other policies, they're very, very forward thinking when it comes to abortion rights and women's right to choose. All of those sorts of things are very, very forward, progressive ideas, much more democratic ideas if you were to compare it to the US. So the political ideologies in Sweden, they don't exactly correspond. It's so interesting that we have these parties that really take hold of one issue in the US, and in Sweden, it's some issues that might be more conservative or more democratic don't necessarily align with the ideologies that are here in Sweden. The next thing I find very, very interesting and a little weird about Swedish politics is how much that people love socialism and even to some extent communism. I remember being in Norrköping and seeing a political ad that said like "Kämpa kommunister," basically trying, I think it was an ad for even the Vänsterpartiet, as I was discussing earlier, that has earlier roots in communistic ideologies. And that's really not like a bad word here in Sweden. If you say communist, it's almost like this really negative word. And even socialist, for example, it's almost like an insult in America if you call somebody a communist or a socialist. Even though in some ways America has a lot of socialistic aspects. You think about police force, firemen, that's tax dollars providing services for everyone. I think in Sweden, they have a really good balance because they have healthcare paid for, they have free colleges and universities. I think all of these things are very, very positive. But in some ways, I think maybe they go a little bit too far because the taxes are very, very high here. The Swedish tax rate is a little bit over 50% for most people because like in my tax bracket, for example, the tax bracket is about 30%, but then your employer also pays a hidden tax that you don't see that your employer pays that is also about 20%. So if you add up the 30% and the 20%, the tax rate is extremely high in Sweden. Yes, you do get a lot for it, but to me, I think like for every dollar that I make, I'm only really keeping 50 cents of it. That's very, very crazy to me. But I think most Swedish people, they appreciate it. They don't mind the high taxes because they know they get so much for it. And you see it in some of these ideologies with some of these red parties that are in power, like the Social Democrats, like the Vänsterpartiet. They do have a lot of representation in the government here in Sweden. And the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the fact that Sweden still has a monarchy here. They still have kings and queens in Sweden. Their current king has been a king for a long, long time, King Carl Gustav, I believe. And what's very, very interesting to me about this is that Sweden is a very, very progressive society that wants to provide benefits for all people, and they don't really view some people better than others. I mean, I just feel like it's a society that treats everybody as equally as possible, at least more than any other society I've lived in. Yet we still have a king, and even though they don't have official responsibilities, they mostly have ceremonial responsibilities. He's basically a public figure for the country to represent the country more ceremoniously. It's still in some part funded by taxpayers, so I think it was something like 60 million Swedish crowns a year go to support the king's official duties. And then of course there's administration, which is actually supported still in part by the Swedish taxpayers. So I think that's very, very interesting. I don't necessarily have a problem with it because it's such a small amount of the taxes we paid in the grand scheme of things, but it's still like sort of in principle, I find it a little bit weird and a little bit fascinating that this country that's so progressive still has a king. And I think it's kind of cool. I think that they probably drive a lot of tourists. They drive some awareness about Sweden. I get that. That's cool. But in terms of like from the politics, it's interesting that we still support that financially. So with that, guys, those are 5 things that I do think are a little bit weird about Swedish politics. I'm curious to see which one of those you thought was the weirdest, so leave me a comment down below. And if you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, be sure to press the subscribe button. I'm getting closer and closer to 100,000 followers here on YouTube, and I couldn't be more excited about that. So a subscribe would go a long way to helping me reach that goal. With that being said, guys, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in another video.